Hello, and welcome to the PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 2, What is Art? In this chapter, we will be looking at art and value, art and beauty, art and appearances, style, art and meaning, iconography, and context. So when we're talking about art in general, of course, we have to think about why we're talking about it, and we talk about it because it has value. And whether that's value to society, historical value, and then, of course, monetary value. And there's lots of different ways that we can tell that art has value if you look around the world around you. Art museums exist for the sole purpose of providing a place to store and to keep these artworks safe. People buy artworks for millions and millions of dollars. And then also, artists over time can become celebrities. We're looking at a painting by one of these artists. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa from 1503, a very well-known artwork. And it's a great example of how art can change value over time. When we think about this in terms of when it was created in 1503, this was the beginning of the High Renaissance. Da Vinci was well known, but he wasn't as well known as he is today. And this particular painting was not as well known as it is today. In fact, you can see if you look at the kind of middle ground there right behind her, you can see she's sitting on some sort of balcony, and you can see an architectural detail behind her. And on the sides of the painting, you'll notice how it's almost clipped or cut off in a strange place. Why bother even painting those little half circles there? Well, in fact, this painting was actually larger to begin with, and over time, one of the owners decided they wanted to make it smaller, so they cut the sides off. So that is an indication to us that this painting was not as valuable as it is now. If you go see it now, it's in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it's behind bulletproof glass. They've got a guard stationed by it, and then it's roped off. So it's considered to be one of the most valuable paintings in the world. And so we just can't fathom this idea that someone would, dare to cut off even an inch of this masterpiece. But that is indeed what happened. Another way that we can tell that this painting has changed value over time is by looking at how other artists use this painting in their work. So this is 30 Are Better Than One by Andy Warhol from 1963. And in it, we can see that he has taken this really famous image, and of course in 1963 it was very, very famous, and he's repeated it 30 times, and he's changed some things about it. So first of all, you'll notice that he's made it black and white instead of color, and he's also made it look like with every reproduction the ink gets less and less, or he has to re-ink his screen and reprint it because some of the images are better quality than others. And so there can be different kind of connotations to this painting. What does this painting mean? Well, Andy Warhol might just say, he was a pop artist. He was famous for just saying he wanted to make money off of his art. And he might just say, well, I just like the Mona Lisa and I wanted to see it 30 times. But other people can look at this and see, well, maybe he's making a comment on how when we see something over and over again, it kind of becomes less valuable. So if you think about where you've seen the Mona Lisa, whether it was in books or movies, magazines, I had a t-shirt with it on there. I've seen it on mouse pads and mugs. You've just about seen it everywhere that an image could possibly be placed. And when you see something like that over and over again, you don't necessarily stop to think about what the artist's intent was. You don't stop to think about the mastery behind the material. You just say, oh yeah, that's the Mona Lisa, and you move on. And so by seeing it over and over again in this mass-produced way, it does lose some of that kind of intrinsic uniqueness, that intrinsic value that an artwork will have when it's created only once. Now, of course, a lot of people would look at the Mona Lisa and say it's a very beautiful painting. And when we get to the Renaissance chapter, we'll discuss a little bit more about what his intent was and his technique that he was using. We're going to look at going to look at another artwork now that some people definitely would say is beautiful. When we first look at this work, it might make your imagination run wild. You might think, oh, look at that hair, look at that water, look at that drapery, or what is that? And you don't really know what it is until you see the title. And I think very few of us would look at that and say, oh, yeah, that's a cabbage leaf right off without reading the title. And that's because of the way that he's presented it to us. We don't think of a cabbage leaf as an object of beauty, and we certainly don't think of it in terms of, its aesthetics and it's being art worthy. But one thing that Weston was known for doing was taking things that were kind of on this ordinary level and elevating it to this level of fine art. And so he's given us this dramatic composition with organic curving lines that we tend to focus on, the deep dark shadows and the bright, bright lights, and those contrasts in between, and it creates this very lovely image. And so art can be very closely connected with beauty. Now, sometimes when we look at art, it can be, it immediately grabs our attention, immediately think, oh, look at that beautiful painting. And then you get a little bit deeper into it and you start to look at the subject matter. And sometimes the subject matter can give you a sense of sadness or, some other emotion rather than just being about the visual pleasure that beauty can give. And this is a good example of that. This is Pieta by Bellini from 1500, so another Renaissance piece. So we're looking at a Christian artwork here in which we're seeing Mary, the mother of Christ, with her son on her lap after he has been crucified and is deceased. And of course, when we think about that subject matter, that's very sad and it's heart-wrenching, and it's hard to look at this painting and just see it as beautiful. You also feel the sadness there. Now, there are a lot of things going on here that make this painting aesthetically pleasing, such as this implied triangle in the foreground of the figures, the use of color, the dramatic sweeping landscape behind them in which the artist has used linear as well as atmospheric perspective. All of these things give it a really pleasing aesthetic, but at the same time it creates a sense of sadness because of the subject matter. Sometimes when we look at an artwork, we have a hard time describing it as beautiful at all. And sometimes artists don't want their work to be beautiful. This is Kronos Devouring One of His Children by Francisco de Goya from 1820 to 22. Now, Goya here really just kind of leaves any notion of pleasure or beauty behind. And what we're seeing, we really can't divide the subject matter from the technique. So when we look at how he's painted this, look at the dramatic brush strokes. Look at the use of this kind of dark, dingy color. Look at the crazed expression on the man's face. And it's really kind of a monochromatic, this kind of brownish green color with just a hint of red. And it's not a very pleasing color. So, the way that he's painted this contributes to the overall feeling of this work as being something that you really don't want to look at for a long time. Now, when we talk about the subject, which is a man eating one of his children, it's disturbing and it's frightening. And all of that is added to by how he has painted it. So we really can't say that this is beautiful at all, but that does not mean that it's not a powerful work of art. In fact, quite the contrary. When we look at this, you get a gut feeling of revulsion, of, of being frightened, whatever it might be, almost immediately because of the subject matter and how he's painted it. So that makes it a powerful work of art. So it really doesn't have to be connected with beauty to be a powerful work of art. In fact, Da Vinci really thought that quote-unquote ugliness was just as worthy as beauty to be studied and to be portrayed, and so he would go out on the street and he would find all types of people, and he really thought that beauty was one extreme, but then ugliness was the other extreme, and he thought they were both equally important. And so this is just kind of an example of that, him doing these studies on these quote-unquote ugly people. So this is going to bring us to the end of the first part of chapter 2, and we will pick up with art and appearance in the next section. This is part 2 of chapter 2, What is Art? In part 1, we looked at art and value and art and beauty, and to begin our discussion for part 2, we're going to look at art and appearances. So when we talk about art and appearance, we're going to be discussing different terms like representational, abstract, non-objective, stylized. And artists usually tend to stick in one of these categories. An exception to that is Pablo Picasso. This is his first communion from 1895. He created this when he was about 14, 15 years old. He was a student at this time. And it's highly what we call representational. Representational means to represent the visual world in a recognizable way. We can also call it naturalistic, but basically it just means that it's faithful representation. Some of the techniques that artists will use to create a representational work of art include things like linear perspective, which you can see in the steps, and how the steps kind of move away from you. It makes it feel like it's going into the distance. Artists will also use proportion and foreshortening. So if you look at the figure who is kneeling, you can see that the artist has used foreshortening to create their second hand there, and you can see how the second hand is much smaller than the hand that is closest to us, and that is a technique called foreshortening. Things look smaller the further away they get. Artists will also use shading to create the look of three-dimensionality, so we can see where light and shadow are falling according to where the light source is. And then, of course, they'll use proportionality, so things like the head will be proportional to the body. And Picasso is a master at all of these. He really does demonstrate here a mastery of these traditional techniques of creating basically a window into another world. Now, when you think of Picasso, you probably don't think of works like this. You probably think of pieces like this. This is Seated Woman Holding a Fan from 1908. This is done in his what we call a more mature style, where he's developed his own personal voice, and the style of Cubism. So in this piece, we still see the subject matter. We can still tell what it is. It's a woman, and she's holding a fan, but it has been simplified and exaggerated. So abstraction, the definition of abstraction means representation that has been purposely simplified or exaggerated. So what has he simplified or exaggerated here? Well, if you look at the woman's body, for example, things that are organically shaped or shapes that exist in the natural world have now become geometric. So look at her nose, it's kind of triangular. Look at her arms, they're cylindrical. Her breast is spherical. So those things have been simplified to create this more geometric feel of an organic object. And we'll talk about the reasons why Picasso develops this style when we get into the history section. So here we have a definite example of how an artist can choose to create abstract art even if they're technically able to create representational art. So it's not that these artists can't paint representationally, it's that they choose not to. And we'll look at some reasons why in just a minute. Sometimes an artist will create works that are really very almost unrecognizable without a title. So when we look at this piece, it's very difficult to tell exactly what is being represented here. And you would say, well, that's not, it's not representational at all. But when you look at the work and you see the title, Woman with Packages, you start to see, oh, okay, I can see the figure there. So at the top, you can kind of see the little orb inside the hair. The vertical post becomes her body. And then the packages are the objects, the more organic objects kind of hanging off her hips there. But without the title, we would have a really hard time understanding what we were looking at. So when we talk about representational versus abstract, I want you to understand that these terms exist on a scale. And sometimes an artwork will be representational, and sometimes it will be highly representational. Sometimes an artwork will be slightly abstract, and sometimes it will be very abstract. And there are certain terms that we can use to help differentiate between these. So for example, if it's extremely, extremely representational, like the next image that I'm going to show you, we call that trompe l'oeil, which is a French term that means fool the eye, and it's a technique that artists use to create representational works that look so realistic it really does look like the object. It doesn't look like a representation. Let me show you an example of that. This is House Painter 3 by Dwayne Hanson from 1984. So when we're looking at this work, you might just think you're looking at a gallery that's being renovated. In fact, if you walk in upon this, you would think, "Oh, wow, that's a real person standing there. Maybe I shouldn't be in here because they're redoing this." And then it would take a second to realize, okay, he's not moving, and this is actually a sculpture. And so it makes you kind of question your reality and question, what representation is and what reality is in a whole kind of new way. Artists will use abstraction and representation to further their content. And sometimes we will see these styles, these appearances used in connection with each other. A great example of that is by looking at the Yoruba culture from Africa. This is Head of a King from the 13th century. This was found at a burial site, and we would describe this as being a representational piece. It's representational because everything is proportional. The features of the person look very individual and accurate, and it looks very much like the person would look in the real world. This was found buried alongside objects like this. This is cylindrical head. So when we look at this, we would say this is abstract. And it's abstract because it is a head that has been purposefully simplified. Okay, so they've taken away the overall shape of the head, and they've just given us these cones up at the top that look like hair. We have holes for the eyes and basically just a line for the mouth. But being a human, we tend to look for human faces in everything that we see. So we automatically see that as being a human head, even though it really looks nothing like a human head. Now, why would a culture, an artist who could create a representational work like the one on the left, also choose to represent the human figure so abstractly and then bury them alongside each other? Well, one explanation is that the figure on the left, the head of a king, is a representation of the physical being of the king. So this is how the king looked on earth, okay? And the sculpture on the right, the cylindrical head, is a representation of his spirit. So a lot of the times abstraction can be used to describe things or to put into a physical form things that are not physical or things that cannot be seen. Sometimes when we look at an artwork, it can look very representational at first glance. But then when we take a closer look at it, we start to notice that it has some abstract qualities. And sometimes cultures will do this kind of across the board in their artwork. This is an Egyptian piece from 1300 BCE called Hasthor and Seti. And in it, we see two Egyptian figures, you probably are familiar with Egyptian art, and you probably can identify this as Egyptian art right away because of the way the figures are standing, because of their clothing, because of the hieroglyphs. And you probably, when you first look at this, think, oh yeah, that's representational. I can see two figures. I can see one's a man, one's a woman, and I know, that they're holding hands, and I can see exactly what they're doing. But when you take a closer look at it, you'll start to see things that are not like the real world. So for example, if you look at the way they're standing, notice how their feet are shown in profile. Their hips and torso are shown towards the front, and then their shoulders are towards the front, and then their head is to the side or the profile view. This is what we call a composite view or twisted perspective, and it's highly unrealistic. Nobody can really stand like that. Not only that, but they appear to be very flat. We don't really see a lot of shadow and light being used to portray any sort of three-dimensionality. A couple last details that I want you to notice. One is the eye, and you'll see how the eye, even though the face is in profile, the eye is facing front. And then if you look at their hands, you'll notice how all the fingers are the same length. And so when we see something like this, where we have an art style that conforms to social norms, or has some sort of societal impact, we call that being stylized. So stylized basically just means representational art that conforms to a preset style. So here is an updated version of that chart that we looked at earlier. On one end, on the left-hand side, you can see that we have representational. If it's highly representational, it's going to be trompe-l'oeil, which means fool the eye. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have abstraction. And stylization is going to fall somewhere in the middle. It's going to tend to be abstract because of the way that the artists are simplifying or exaggerating, but it's still slightly representational. Now, on the very opposite end of the spectrum from representational, we have non-objective art. And non-objective art is art that is relying on the formal elements of art um, rather than creating recognizable subject matter. So everything we've looked at up until this point has had a subject matter that you can recognize. Even if it's been abstracted, you can still look at it and say, okay, yes, I see that figure. After I look at the title, whatever it might be, I do see a figure there. So non-objective art, you're not going to be able to do that. It's going to be purely about those formal elements and principles of designs that we will discuss in chapters 4 and 5. Vasily Kandinsky was the first artist to move beyond representation in his work. This is his composition 9 from 1936, and in it you can see that we really don't have any recognizable forms. We see line and shape and color and pattern, texture, movement, all kinds of those elements and principles of design that we're going to talk about in chapters 4 and 5, but we don't see any human figures, any animals, landscape elements, nothing of that type. Now, Kandinsky invented this type of art because he felt that art should be more like music. In other words, when you think about listening to a song, you're not constantly trying to figure out what it represents, are you? You're just listening to it and enjoying it. You're just feeling it. You're letting it move you as it will. So Kandinsky wanted you to be able to look at an artwork and to have that same sort of experience. So you're not looking at it trying to figure out what it is, what it represents. You're just feeling it and you're letting it move you. Sometimes artists will start from a place of representation and they'll work their way into abstraction and even into non-objective art. So I just wanted to quickly show you an artist who does that. This is Theo van Doesburg. This is his abstraction of a cow from 1916. So the first image that we're looking at here in this series is pretty representational. You can see a cow, and you can see shadow and light. You can see the proportion. You even have landscape elements in the background. And then he abstracts it into these geometric forms. You can still see that it's a cow and you still have some light and shadow, but everything has been simplified and moved into these more geometric shapes. Then he adds color, so we lose those variations of lights and darks. Now we just have black and white, so we don't have any gray. And then all of a sudden he goes to this. So it's kind of just an interesting practice to see how an artist can start from an image of representation and work their way even into a non-objective piece. So artists can be inspired by things that are representational, but end up in a place that is non-objective. This ends part 2 of chapter 2. We will begin with part 3 in the next section. This is section 3 of chapter 2, in which we will discuss style. Every artist has their own unique style. Style just refers to characteristics in an artist's work that can be constant, coherent, or reoccurring. A great example of that is we look at the artwork by Vincent van Gogh. This is his 2 works by him called Starry Night, and then we have another one called Wheat Field and Cypress Trees. And these works are very different subject matters. And one, we have a night scene where we also have a city represented, and then the other, we have a wheat field out in the country during the day. But when we look at these two, we can see some characteristics that are reoccurring, coherent, and that stay the same from one to the other. So specifically, let's look at the way Van Gogh uses his brushstroke. Van Gogh is known for his textural brushstroke, in which he builds up layers and layers of paint to create this really rich surface. You can see that particularly well in the sky. Look at the way he uses rhythmic brushstrokes that are parallel to each other in both of these scenes to create a sky that is just writhing and moving. You can also look at the use of color. He uses a lot of complementary colors, or colors that bounce off of each other. So in Starry Night, we see yellows and blues. And then in Wheatfield and Cypress Trees, we're seeing purples and greens and yellows, all colors that are very vibrant and that create a very dynamic scene for our eye to take in. Another thing that makes Van Gogh's style unique is his subject matter. In both of these, we happen to have landscape. He was also known for creating portraits and still lifes. Very common subjects for the post-impressionist style that he worked in. So as we can see, we can look at two very different paintings by the same artist, and if it's done in their mature style, you should be able to see some characteristics that are similar from one to another. We can look at a painting and it can have a subject matter, and if that subject matter is created in a different style, let's say by another artist, it can have a completely different meaning. So we're going to look at three pieces now that all have the same subject matter, that of women getting their hair done, but they're done in completely different styles by different people and in different time periods, and because of that they have different meanings. So we're looking here at Hairdressing by Utamaro. This is a woodcut print from 1798 from Japan. And we can see exactly what's going on here, which is a woman getting her hair done. And it's done in a stylized way that we can associate with Japanese wood prints. So we can see the use of flat, broad areas of color. We can see very flat images with very little shading. We see really no background, no setting, and all of those are things that we can kind of associate with that Japanese style. So when we look at this piece, we really get a sense of what life was like, and we don't get a lot of emotional content, and there's not a lot to read into. We get to see how things were done and how a woman of higher standing would have had her hair dressed in the morning or during the day. In this one, we're getting to see that same subject matter. So we're seeing a woman having her hair combed. This is by Edgar Degas. He was an Impressionist artist who was working in the 1880s. And in this work, we're seeing a more representational piece where we're seeing a nude female getting her hair done by her, looks like, servant. In this very intimate setting, we have a lot of warm colors. We have a very soft, kind of natural sense of lighting. And all of these things lead to the content of, seeing this woman in a way that we wouldn't normally see her, but that she feels very comfortable. She looks like she's relaxed, if not, enjoying herself. And again, it goes to that content of seeing this woman in kind of an unguarded moment. Now this one is called Maggie's Ponytail by Susan Rothenberg, and in it we're seeing a somewhat non-objective, somewhat abstract artwork where we're getting to see perhaps a little girl getting her ponytail done by looks like parents. If you look down at the right hand corner, you can see a little hand reaching back with a circle, which looks like a ponytail holder. Straight up from that little hand, you'll see a pair of arms holding the ponytail. It took me a long time to be able to see that. It took me a lot of analysis to be able to figure out what exactly I was looking at. And that is because this is so far on the kind of end of the abstract spectrum that it's almost non-objective. In fact, the background is non-objective. So we have this really vibrant red background. We don't get a sense of setting or anything. It's just the color red. And that can mean different things to different people. So if I think about a little girl getting her ponytail done and then I think about the color red, different things come to mind. So I was a little girl once. I know what it's like to get your hair combed by someone else, and I know that it can be painful. So maybe the red is representing pain. But I also know as a mother that it can be a loving act, doing your daughter's hair every day. It takes time, and it is a loving act, and so perhaps the red represents love in this case, and it really is going to depend on the viewer who brings their own life experience to a painting like this, and you know what that color and what these images mean to you. So you can see by looking at these three very different paintings and print that we can have the same subject matter of a person getting their hair done, but depending on the style, depending on the appearance that the work is created in, we're going to get different meanings. And that is going to lead us into our next section, the final section of Chapter 2, in which we will be discussing, amongst other things, art and meaning. Welcome to Chapter 2, What is Art? Part 4. In this chapter, we will be discussing, amongst other things, art and meaning. So we've already slightly discussed subject matter, form, and slightly content. I want to go a little bit more into the specifics of what these terms mean. I also wanted to give you this formula that you can see on your screen right now. Subject matter plus form equals content. So what does this mean? Well, subject matter is what is being represented. So in other words, the objects or people or places that a painting represents. Now, form is how those objects, people, or places are represented. So in other words, the appearance, style, elements of art, and principles of design in a work of art. And then finally, content is the meaning of a work of art. So that is different from subject matter. Subject matter is simply what you are seeing, and content is the meaning behind that. So once again, subject matter, what is being represented, plus form, the appearance, style, elements of art, and principles of design equals content, or the meaning of a work of art. So now we're going to look at a couple of works of art by a man named Henry Matisse. And in these works, he alters the form of basically the same subject matter in order to create different content. So the first thing that we're going to do when we're looking at a painting is to figure out the subject matter. A great place to start is always the title. So this is called a music lesson, and you can see that it is basically about a music lesson. Some of the other things that we see are several people. We see a window with a garden outside. We see a mother perhaps teaching her son the piano. The piano has a violin on it. All of these things together create a very rich interior space. Now, a year before he actually painted the music lesson, he painted piano lesson. So you can see this one's from 1916, and the subject matter is the same, or close to the same. We have a little boy who is playing the piano, and he is working away at it. Now, in terms of the other objects that we see in the space, it is quite different. So we see the piano, but there is no violin. Instead, we have a triangular metronome in the bottom right-hand corner. You see that gray triangle. And then on the other side of the piano, we have a little yellow candlestick with a candle that's been mostly burnt down. You can see the window behind the piano. However, it's kind of ambiguous here. We don't really know exactly what that is, and you might not know at all what it is if you hadn't seen the other painting. But there is this kind of triangular slab of green, which could represent grass. And then in the lower left-hand corner of the painting, you see some odd small woman that is probably a statue, but again, it's ambiguous here. And then floating above the boy on the upper right-hand corner, you have this kind of mysterious woman figure. Now, if you look at the other painting, you can see, oh yeah, that's the painting that's on the wall. But again, there's a sense of ambiguity about this painting. She's really not sure exactly what these objects are, so that kind of lends it this, oh, maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling. Now, it's we're going to go a little bit further when we are going to discuss our form here. So we've talked about the appearance. The one on the right is more representational. The one on the left is more abstract. Now, when we talk about form, we have to analyze iconography or symbols in a work of art, and we'll talk about that more later on. But some of the symbols that you can see here, we have the metronome, which represents the idea of learning music, of studying rhythm as it keeps that regular beat. Then you have the candle that has been burned mostly down. Whenever you see a candle in a work of art, it usually represents time passing. And so because this is so far burnt down, you can see that a lot of time has passed. And then there's this green slab outside that the boy is separated from with these pretty prominent black swirling lines that turns out to be a gate. And if you look at the boy himself, you can see that half of his face is kind of hidden in this triangular shadow. So you see that the triangle here is repeated many times and is an important shape as it draws our eyes to these very important symbols. So let's put the fact that this is abstract. We have these symbols that represent education, time passing, separation from outside. And we can also talk about, color here. It's much more of a muted palette. Although both paintings have basically the same colors in it, the piano lesson has much more gray. So it's just a little bit more depressing. Okay, so put all those things together and you're going to get the content. Okay, so the content of piano lesson is about a boy studying music and having to learn that craft, and it's not always fun, and sometimes you wish you were doing other things, and sometimes it feels like it drags on forever, but it's necessary in order to become proficient at it. Okay, so then the one on the right, because we have this much more lush interior, we have other figures that are present that actually are representing Matisse himself and his wife, and the little boy is his son. But basically what it is you have a family there. You have other musical instruments that indicate that other members of the family play music. It's not just the boy. This particular painting, you put the form, which is this more representational, lush, colorful, inviting scene, together with the subject matter, which is the music lesson, and you're going to get the content, which in this case is about the social aspect of music and the fact that it kind of brings people together and it can be enjoyable. So you can see that by altering the form of the same subject matter, you can get very different contents. So we're going to look at two more works that alter form, but have the same subject matter. So this is The Kiss by Rodin from 1886. And so if we're looking at the subject matter, it is about a kiss. But let's look at the form. It's very representational. The figures are nude and they're embracing, they're kissing, and it's very lustful. So this is more about kind of the physical nature of the kiss. Because we have the physical nature of the bodies being represented, we can say that. This particular piece is also called The Kiss by Constantine Brancusi from 1916. So same subject matter, same material being stone or marble, but very different forms and therefore very different contents. So here we have much more of an abstract form. We have the figures there that have been purposefully simplified into these small rectangular shapes. Really the only difference between the man and the woman is the slight outline of the breast. And then you have these strong horizontal lines of their arms that cut across their vertical bodies and kind of tie them together. And then you can see their lips are touching, and then their eyes are right up against each other. And you can see half an eye on each figure, but when you look at it from the front, it kind of looks like one eye. So the idea behind this sculpture is that the kiss is something that can bring two people together. And it's more about the spiritual or emotional connection that two people can have, rather than the physical nature. So because Rodin's piece is emphasizing naturalism and emphasizing the body, we can see that that one is about the physical nature of the kiss. And then this one, because it's emphasizing these more abstract qualities and this unity, okay, of the two figures, we can say that this is representing the emotional connection of a kiss. Another thing that can affect meaning in a work of art is the material that an object is made out of, or material that the artwork is made out of. This is a great example of that. This is Gnaw by Janine and Tony from 1992. And in this piece, if you don't have the materials, you don't have the meaning. So let me give you a little bit of rundown on what we're seeing here. We're seeing an installation, which is an artwork that takes up a whole gallery space. When you walk into the gallery, you're confronted by these two large blocks. You can see the first block on the lower left-hand corner is a 600-pound block of chocolate. The white block next to it is a 600-pound block of lard. Both of these blocks have, when you get up close to them, you can see that they have teeth marks along the edges. So they have been gnawed by the artist. And then you walk further into the gallery and you see in the corner on the upper left-hand side there, you can see a display case that looks like maybe a higher end department store. You walk up close to it and you see the objects that are in it. There's a close-up of the objects in the lower right-hand corner of the image that we're looking at. And you can see that it is lipstick, this really bright red lipstick, and then you also have this heart-shaped candy box, and you'll notice that the candy box is empty. So what does this mean? What is the meaning behind this? Well, in order to figure that out, we have to look at the form. We have to think about the material and how the material is being used. So when we look at the 500-pound block of chocolate with teeth marks along the edges, you know, you have to ask yourself, what does this mean? What does chocolate mean? What do I think of when I think of chocolate? So the first thing I think of when I think of chocolate is yum. Chocolate is something that it brings a lot of pleasure to people, and it's something that you eat for a treat. However, you know, you can also think about it in another way, is if I eat this 600-pound block of chocolate, what's going to happen to me? And that's unhealthy, of course. You probably gain weight. And then you might look at this next block of the lard and you might think, okay, well, if I eat this chocolate, I'm going to turn into this block of lard. So when you see a 600-pound block of lard, what do you think of? Well, you think of something that's revolting, probably, because it's just a block of fat sitting there. And then you see the teeth marks, and that really makes you kind of disgusted. Okay, so we have this one block that's kind of alluring, and then we have this next block that's pretty disgusting. Okay, so when you take a look at the objects in the store window display, the chocolate box that looks like a heart was actually made out of the chocolate that the artist gnawed. Okay, so it's actually chocolate, even though it just looks like an empty box, it's actually chocolate. And then the lipstick was made out of the lard. So there's a connection between the objects that we're seeing in the display case and these materials, is basically this block of material in the middle of the floor. So then we have to think about, well, why is she making this connection? What is she trying to say here? Okay, so let's think about what these objects represent. What does the heart represent? A lot of the times when you see this kind of cliched heart with the chocolates, you think of Valentine's Day. Okay, so what is Valentine's Day? Valentine's Day is this day celebrating love, mostly romantic love, in which kind of a traditional gift is to give chocolate. Okay, we'll come back to that. And then we have this lipstick. Okay, so what does lipstick represent? What does that mean? Well, it can mean a lot of different things depending on the person who's viewing it. Some people say, well, it represents beauty. Other people will say it represents vanity. So it could represent either one of those things. It could represent femininity. It could represent sexuality. Okay, so let's think about why do women wear lipstick? Well, one reason is to make themselves feel pretty, maybe to go out and attract a mate. Okay, so what happens when they attract a mate? When the Valentine's Day comes around and they get a box of chocolates. So let's say they eat all of those chocolates and they just can't stop. Okay, So they're going to gain weight. They're going to turn into that 600-pound block of lard there. And if the person they attracted with the lipstick is shallow, then they'll get dumped. So what happens when you get dumped? What do you do to make yourself feel better? Well, one thing I do is to eat chocolate. And then, you might also, if you want to attract somebody else, you might put on some lipstick and go on out and try and attract another mate. So it's really about this kind of vicious cycle that happens in society and these societal pressures on women, and, to look their best, but also to enjoy these pleasures of life, such as chocolate. A good example of that is to be seen in if you're ever in a shopping, grocery store at the checkout. I want you to pay attention to the women's magazines and notice how you'll see the same magazine. Okay, it'll be a headline like "Lose 10 pounds in 10 days," and then it'll also say something like "Double fudge chocolate recipe" inside. So it is this kind of contradiction within itself, and I think that's what this piece is about. The next section that we'll be discussing is the iconography section. And iconography, it refers to the study of symbols within a work of art. And something that is obviously very important when we're just trying to discover the meaning within works. An era in art that was known for their use of iconography was the Renaissance. This is Arnolfini double portrait from Jan van Eyck from 1434. So this would be more of the Northern Renaissance piece. And in this work, you can see lots of different objects, lots of different even animals and just everyday objects that you might not think have any special meaning. But if you take the time and really analyze every one of these objects and details, you will figure out the two possible meanings of this work of art, depending on what meaning we give these icons. So let's just first start by pointing out some of the objects that you might see. Bottom left-hand corner, those kind of pointy white things, those are shoes. In the middle on the bottom, you see a dog. Of course, we have a couple that are the focal point that are right in the middle holding hands. Right next to the man on the left-hand side, you will see an open window. Under that window, you see some fruit. In the middle, behind the couple, you'll see a mirror. Above the mirror, you see a chandelier with one candle. And then behind the woman on the right-hand side, you see a bed. So let's go through each one of these and talk about their possible meanings. So the shoes, we can see two pairs of shoes, so that means that the figures are standing there in their bare feet. Depending on the meaning, it could either be that they took their shoes off because they are on holy ground, or perhaps just because they're inside. Let's go with that first meaning. So let's say they took their shoes off because they're on holy ground. The dog is there to represent fidelity or loyalty. The fruit is there to represent loyalty, or fertility. The mirror is there reflecting the figures and a third person, and that third person is a witness. The chandelier has one candle lit to represent the presence of God. The bed is there to represent the marriage bed. You can see how she's kind of holding up her dress. It almost looks like she's pregnant. That is there to represent the idea of fertility. It's not meant to show that she is actually pregnant. So if we put those symbols together in that way, this is a record of their marriage. We're actually seeing them get married right now. However, there is some debate as to whether that is the correct meaning. If we interpret the symbols in another way, we get a completely different meaning. So the shoes are off because they're inside. The dog is there because he's a pet. The fruit is there for a snack. In the mirror, we see that third person, he's the artist painting them. The candle, there's only one candle because it's daytime and candles are expensive. And we don't need that much light during the day. And then the bed is there because in the Renaissance, if you had a bed in your living room, it was considered a sign of wealth. So all of these things put together, and we're just seeing a record of their engagement. So they just got engaged, not married. So depending on the way you interpret these icons, you're going to get a different meaning. You're going to get a different content. So it's another aspect of form, is that iconography. All right, our last section for this chapter will be context. And context refers to the larger web of connections within the world that an artwork has. So an artwork does not exist in a vacuum. So a good example of that is to think about, well, why in the world did Picasso invent Cubism? Part of the reason he invented Cubism was the use of photography that was prevalent during the time period. Prior to this, artists had, part of their job was to record, the world as it was. That was the only way we had a record. But when photography came about, it really freed artists up to explore more expressionistic aspects of art. And so we're going to see more abstraction happen. And so part of the reason, Cubism exists is because of the invention of photography. And so without thinking about the context, we wouldn't get the full picture. This is finial of a linguist staff from Ghana from the 20th century. We're seeing this finial in isolation in this photograph, as it would be very much be in a museum. When you look at it, you'll tend to focus on, you'll look at the subject matter. It's a man holding an egg, and then you'll look at the form. It's abstracted. The head is large. There's a lot of fine detail. It's done in gold. So perhaps this is an important man. He must be very smart if his head is large. All of those things kind of come to mind when you look at it. What's missing here is the original context. So if we look at this photograph, we're seeing similar finials in their original context, which would be in some sort of ceremonial procession, and they would be held by their owners. Okay, and so really their importance as an object is what they represent as their owners. So they represent basically their owners' position in society. And so it's not really that important necessarily, all of this fine detail and analyzing all of that. What they find most important is how it represents the individual person holding it. So again, without that, looking at that larger context, that larger connection to the world, we don't fully understand this object. So that's a really important part of going through and studying art. And as we move forward, hopefully it will be one of those things that we consider deeply. This is the end of chapter 2.